This talk is about gin. The basic premise of the talk is, first of all, that there's a book about alcohol which calls it the ambiguous molecule. My first premise is that alcohol is very much an ambiguous molecule. It has lots of positive attributes. Those of us who enjoy a gin and tonic in the garden on hot afternoons will appreciate that positive attribute. Those of us who've drunk champagne at weddings or christened the baby's head will appreciate those positive attributes. Those of us who've worked down a coal mine all day long or worked in a steel mill all day long will appreciate the positive attributes of some pints of beer at the end of it, and so on. Equally well documented are the negative attributes, as we'll see in this talk, both for the individual health, individual families, as fathers drank their family earnings away, and collectively for society, in drunken disorder, and all that flows from that. That's what has always interested me about alcohol. The second thing, that the premise of the talk is, alcohol, it's not just about what you drink in a glass. The way that we consume alcohol and think about alcohol is embedded in all aspects of society, culture, politics, economics, and so on. That also makes it an interesting topic of study. And the third thing is, for the purposes of this afternoon, I've angled the talk towards Yorkshire's experience of gin up to the present day. So hopefully it's not too much of a whistle stop, but we're going to go back to the early origins of gin and come all the way down to the present day. That's basically what I'm trying to do. The first thing, then, the first slide please, Margaret, is what makes gin gin, so to speak. What makes gin gin are these things: juniper berries. I'm told by botanists that it's, strictly speaking, not a berry but a clove. But that's immaterial to our purposes this afternoon. It's that gives gin its distinctive flavour. Those of you who drink gin will know that it has a very distinctive flavour to it. And equally, that gives gin its name, from Dutch Geneva and French Genièvre, the words for these berries. Distilling is thought to have originated in the Far East, but there's evidence of distilling in medieval Italy in the 12th century. So it's a reasonably long-standing practice. Again, I'm not a scientist any more than I'm a botanist, not a chemist rather, but I'm told that distilling is reasonably easy to do. It's not difficult. I should warn you that it's also illegal to distill your own spirits from carrots or whatever you've got at home. Unlike brewing your own beer, distilling your own spirits is illegal. But it's a relatively simple process and spread in Europe in the 15th and 16th century. First of all, distilling from wine, brandy became the most popular, but then originating particularly in Holland, we get distilling from grain. And with the admixture of juniper, that's the origins of modern gin. Of course, the gin we drink today is much more refined than the gin that people drank in the 16th, 17th and 18th century. But those are the origins of it. From the first, it was taken really for two reasons. The first is for health and medicine, and the second is for pleasure. The juniper berry has long thought to have medicinal qualities, going back to antiquity. It's used for a variety of health purposes. It features in Pliny the Elder, for example. One of the things apparently it's good for is constipation. And indeed, Samuel Pepys in his diary talks about drinking some strong water or gin in order to help his constipation. And in Pepys's inimitable style, it seemed to have worked, because he said he managed to break a fart or two, and everything was okay as a result of drinking the gin. Equally, he talks about drinking gin for pleasure, strong waters, as he calls them. He talks about going into a public house in London for some strong waters, and the context is quite clearly for the purposes of more or less intoxication. So from the first, this is the mid-17th century, of course, you have the dual function for health and for pleasure. But as time went by, it's the pleasure aspect that came to the fore. Although alcohol has been claiming medicinal properties well into modern times. You may remember that Dubonnet was good for your nerves. They're no longer allowed to advertise these things as good for your nerves. And pregnant women were long advised to drink some porter during their pregnancy. Equally, pregnant women are no longer advised to drink any alcohol, let alone plenty of draughts of porter. So if we go to the next slide, please. I suppose we have to begin really with the most celebrated episode in the history of gin. That's what's come to be called the gin craze of the early 18th century. This is the Hogarth's famous engraving of Gin Lane. Without spending too much time, the reason why you had this explosion of gin drinking, predominantly in the capital. London, as you will know, had far and away the biggest population in the country at this time, far in excess of the next cities in the early 18th century. That's places like Bristol or Norwich. So you have this huge concentration of people, a huge concentrated market for a new drink. Second reason is that the government deregulated the sale and production of gin, essentially to help agriculture and also to raise revenue. So there's tax on the production of it, but there's no restriction on who can distill it and who can sell it. Added to that is the economy at the time was producing rising real wages, so ordinary people had more disposable income. And before the advent of modern affluent society, when poorer people got more money, they tended to spend it on immediate gratification, immediate pleasure, especially when your life expectancy may not be much more than 22. It doesn't make sense to put your money in ISAs. It makes sense to put your money in a dram of gin. So there's an explosion of gin drinking. We have statistics of its production, for what 18th century statistics are worth, which show several million gallons of gin has been consumed. I did a rough and ready calculation, an extremely rough and ready calculation, which suggested that the average adult in early 18th century London may have been drinking 2 pints of gin a week. And I stress an extremely rough and ready statistic. But you have a well-documented explosion of gin drinking. Nowhere better exemplified than in Hogarth's famous engraving. You can spend a lot of time talking about what's in this engraving, but the key features are about the woman at the centre with the baby falling to its doom. The sign that you can see is a gin shop in a cellar, and that's the sign that has the famous slogan, "Drunk for a penny, dead drunk for twopence, clean straw for nothing." It's written over the entrance there. We know where this is because of the church in the background. It puts it in a poor neighbourhood of London called St Giles. So later historians, notably Peter Clarke, have rather cast doubt on just how true a representation this is. Dorothy George, in her still justly well-regarded history of London in the 18th century, regards it as a true evocation of early 18th century London. Peter Clarke is a lot more sceptical and spends some time undermining the idea of gin as increasing mortality, as producing rampant crime and so on. What is certain is that there is a big explosion in the history of gin drinking. And so without going through all the features, you can see on the left the pawnbrokers there is doing a roaring trade in a beautiful building, whereas other buildings are ruinous, and you can see the coffin there at the undertaker's. You know, all kinds of more or less unpleasant things happening to people. The next one, please, Emma. Hogarth did these as two companion pieces. This is the companion Beer Street. Instead of being in a squalid lane in St Giles, we're now in a new street in Westminster. You get the contrast between the two, and everything is prosperous. Beer is regarded as a completely acceptable drink. So it's full of rotund Englishmen there with the foaming tankards. There's a puny Frenchman. Of course, the French subsist on wine and are generally massively inferior to the English. And then a variety of other indicators of prosperity associated with the drinking of beer. Particularly by way of the contrast, the pawnbrokers is now in ruins. There's Mr. Pinch, the pawnbroker, which is now boarded up, and the sign, as you can see, is awry. So in prosperous Beer Street, nobody is having recourse to the pawnbroker. What is undeniable is the extent of consumption in the early 18th century. But consumption, the gin, whilst the craze is really a London phenomenon, the drinking of gin spreads round the country as a whole. If we can have the next one, please, then. A lot of the gin drinking in the craze is lower class gin drinking, but there's quite a lot of evidence to show how gin was consumed by all classes. So one piece of evidence from Yorkshire here, I guess many of you are familiar with Bing, the Torrington Diaries. If you're not, they're well worth a look. He's one of those people who travel and all they can find to do is complain about things. He's a fairly acerbic commentator on his travels around the north of England. But those volumes, the Andrews volumes, reproduce a number of bills from various places that Torrington stayed at. This is the Spread Eagle Inn in Settle, and as you can see, Geneva is one of the items that's on the pre-printed bill. So because better off people are staying at inns in the 18th century, this indicates that gin consumption has reached all classes by the 18th century. Torrington has some fairly miserable things to say about the Spread Eagle. He calls it, I can give you the exact words if you like, he calls it, he had the worst room in a bad and dismal inn in Settle. And he says he was kept awake all night by the mice running behind the wainscoting. So not the most favourable picture of the Spread Eagle Inn. But it's quite clear that along with rum, brandy, coffee and tea, you can see there at the top, that gin is an essential part of the offer of inns at this time. Equally, just another source which I know some of you are familiar with, a member of the minor Yorkshire gentry in the early 19th century, a guy called John Simpson, who originated from Knaresborough, but who fetched up in Bradford for a few months. Again, like Torrington, he absolutely loathed Bradford. He has not a good word to say about it. Full of money grubbers, no culture, no nothing. And Simpson longed to get back to the countryside and the country gentry way of life, which he eventually did. He inherited some money. But he comments a lot on alcohol consumed by his chums among the professional and gentry in early 19th century Bradford. So he frequently comments on drinking gin and water. This is a common enough way of drinking it in the past, evenly between the gin and the water. And he notes that his father drank a bottle of Holland's gin a day for the last 8 years of his life, I think it was. Bottle of gin a day is some considerable consumption. You would be in serious, you'd be having serious problems if you were drinking that level. But apparently this did him no harm whatsoever. The specifying Holland's gin is a superior brand. It was more expensive, imported obviously from the Netherlands, whereas everyday gin, home distilled gin, was a rather inferior quality. Eventually, the gin consumption declined. I won't go into all that, but it began to pick up again in the late 18th and early 19th century. And in the first 2 decades of the 19th century, and especially after the wars are over, there's a big surge in the consumption of spirits. Added to that, the concentrated market that towns and cities provide. Add to that some interesting technical developments, like the development of plate glass, for example, the development of gas lighting, leads us towards the famous gin palaces or gin shops. And these have been exemplified again by a series of engravings by George Cruikshank. His most famous series is a series called The Bottle, that demonstrates, from a temperance point of view, the evil effects of alcohol. But he did these rather fine illustrations of London gin shops. Here you can see here the Angel. That's the exterior. And the next one, please. This is an interior of a gin shop. It has all the classic features. The beautiful counter there. It has the landlord and the landlady. As you can see, the landlady all jewels and lace, the wife of the landlord who coins his bright gold out of the ruin of the youthful and old. And it has all the images that the temperance movement were to develop so much. The drunken husband and the wife trying to get him to go home, the drunken women quarrelling at the back, the child there tugging on the mother's skirts to try and get her to come home. All these hugely familiar throughout the 19th and into the 20th century. There's a temperance song that has the lines, "Father, dear Father, come home with me now," as the child tries to persuade Father to come out of the pub. And as you can see again, the woodwork at the back, the mirrors, the barrels, all these are features of the early 19th century gin shop. The next slide brings us to Yorkshire again. There's much more evidence of gin consumption in the early 19th century. Particularly in what in this part of the world in Lancashire were called dram shops, from the measure of spirit which you got. The reports of dram shops from all over, from bigger towns and cities like Hull, for example. There's a report of a dram shop in Hull, where it describes the customers going in, having their shot of spirits and going out again, a kind of rapid turnover of custom in these places. Even up in Richmond, the journal of a chap called Fotheringay talks about going into Chadwick's dram shop. The dram shops are places that quite simply specialise in the sale of spirits, gin particularly at this time. And what you find is that some of the older inns began to convert a part of their premises into dram shops, catering to working class customers, if you like. So this is the Bowling Green Hotel in Bradford. It's a really old photo because it was demolished in 1870. Anybody from Bradford, it's where the Mechanics Institute was later built. And anybody not that old, it's more or less where Centenary Square is now. The Mechanics Institute in turn was demolished in modern times. But in this picture of the old Bowling Green Hotel with its characteristic balcony and everything, you can see there the dram shop to the left. So the dram shop, you would go into a separate entrance, and it specialised in the sale of a dram of spirits. And these proliferated, particularly in the three biggest cities rather, Leeds, Bradford and Sheffield. You look at the next one, please, Margaret. So this is a surviving plan of an interior of another old inn in Bradford. You can see the bottom there is the dram shop. You can see its counter, and you can see a separate entrance. So the inn's customers still have their dining room and their bar and their tap room, but there's a separate kind of entrance for the lower class customers in the gin shops. The Knight's Head was in Peace Yard. It was demolished and they later built the Bradford building, the houses, the Bradford Club, if you know Peace Yard there in the centre. What happened is that a guy called Roberts gutted the interior and created a single gin shop with all the features. He spent £2,000 converting the interior into a dram shop. The local magistrates, the borough bench, did their best to try and stop these conversions because they thought that spirit drinking was leading to all kinds of drunkenness and debauchery and crime amongst the lower orders. They failed to do so, and by the 1860s, which is when we're talking of, there were around 50 dram shops in the centre of Bradford. Incidentally, you can see the brew house at the back. This place is still brewing its own beer at this time. Sorry, next one then. And the next one, please, Matt. This is another photograph that shows just how ubiquitous drinking places were in Victorian and Edwardian cities. This is Westgate in Bradford. Very briefly, you have there the Pack Horse, which is what was called a market pub, where market traders had a commercial room and would transact business there. In the background is a beer house. These were places that just sold beer. And to the right is a gin palace style pub, the Boy and Barrel. The building is still there. And this is another pub where an old inn, an 18th century inn, the interior was gutted, if you like, and a single big room where customers could come in, stand up, drink their tot of spirits, it's a different kind of experience to sitting in a tap room playing dominoes and so on. It's more an urban drinking experience, if you like, where customers are coming and going and moving from one dram shop to another. The Manor House building was totally reconstructed. The Pack Horse was demolished in the 1960s, and the modern buildings built on the corner. Although there was a new Pack Horse pub there for some years. Next one, please, Margaret. And one can find examples of these kind of gin palace pubs all over Yorkshire. This is possibly the most famous one in Leeds, the Garden Gate, down in Hunslet, if anybody ever ventured down to that part of Leeds anymore. It's a good many years since I was there, but the interior is, or was, as splendid as the exterior, as you can see there. Although I do remember sitting in the tap room with nursing my pint, thinking about Victorian architecture like you do, and some guys came in with two really vicious-looking bulldogs. So I daredn't move for about an hour because these dogs just sat looking malevolently at me. And then eventually they got up and I was able to get out. It's a bit of a wasteland, is that part of Hunslet nowadays, but the pub is well worth checking out if it's the same as it was. Next one, please. And although it's not in Yorkshire, this is one of my absolute favourites of this kind of gin palace pub. This is the Princess Louise in Holborn. It's just on New Oxford Street, away from the big crossroads. A pub that was built in the 1870s, and this shows the interior. It was rather, if you know it, you might disagree with me, but it was rather insensitively refurbished, allegedly to take it back to its Victorian origins. Not wholly successfully to me, but this shows its Victorian splendour, the woodwork, the glasswork, the beautiful ceiling, and all the other work there. It also had, you can't see them here, it had these what were called snob screens, little partitions that partitioned the customer off from the counter so that you were more privately served. If you're ever around there, it really is a splendid pub. Although it's owned by Samuel Smiths, who have a rather odd reputation in the world of the licensed trade. Next one, please. And again, this kind of interior, eventually it was utilised in all late Victorian Edwardian public houses, as well as specifically gin shops. This is a superb example from Bradford, again taken in the mid-1980s. This is the main public room. This lady there practically lived in this pub. I used to live quite near there and quite often went there, and these people seem to live there. Because it was more or less unchanged from when it was done in the first decade of the 19th century. And those of you who know Bradford, George certainly does. The interior was ripped out. Most of it wound up in a skip. And there was apparently nothing that anybody could do about it. It was later converted into a patisserie, which, if you know Barker End Road, is a fairly unlikely setting for a patisserie. And more recently, it's been at least 2 burger restaurants, but I have yet to see anybody coming or going. So unless George knows better, I have no idea what this building is now being used for. I dread to think. But it certainly didn't seem to be selling too many patisseries or burgers. What is tragic is that really striking interior was dispersed, was destroyed. Next one, please, then. And finally, just to end the gin palace style, this is a nice example that still exists in Harrogate. Hale's Bar. W.H. Hale was a wine and spirit merchant, and he fitted out part of the business, as you can see in this gin palace style. So although it has modern bits and pieces like the stuffed birds and what have you, it's still basic gin shop interior with the woodwork, the mirrors, and the rather splendid counter. And it did have little gas flames on the counter, so you could light your cigar. And I think they may have had to cover them up or do something with them because of health and safety nowadays. Next one, please. I should say something briefly about the temperance movement. I mean, alcohol consumption was much greater in the past than it is now. Almost certainly greater in the 17th and 18th century. Although it declined in the 19th century, it was still at much higher levels than now. To counter that, they developed the 19th century temperance movement. So much has been written about this, and time prevents me from going into it in great detail. It started out as an anti-spirits movement. Bradford hosts the first temperance society in England. It was specifically anti-spirits at first, but then it came to include all kinds of alcoholic drink. And this rather splendid painting, I don't know how well you can see it from the slide, is by a guy called Robert Summers, who was a railway worker from Darlington, who was nicknamed the Darlington Hogarth. It's not quite up to Hogarth, but it's quite an interesting representation of the arguments against drink. So on the left-hand side you have the Britannia public house, you have the prosperous landlord with his children there in the fancy clothes, the little boy in his sailor suit. You have a general kind of drift of people towards the gin palace. You can see that the barman there is throwing somebody out. And all these characters have names. There was a key so that you could identify the names of all the characters. So the landlord is called something like, I can tell you exactly what drink sell, care not. The landlord is drink sell, care not. And the two women here are Mrs. Wild and Loose, who are enticing this character who's thought to be a representation of Summers, obviously down into the gin shop. And it's full of representations of the evils of drink. The guy assaulting his wife there. Somebody's hanged themselves in the room opposite. And all the buildings that look prosperous, like the jail, and the buildings that look dilapidated, as a product of the evils of drink. Next one, please. Another facet of temperance is the Band of Hope. The Band of Hope was set up in Leeds by a chap who rejoiced in the name of the Reverend Jabez Tunnicliffe. There's a little plaque on the other side of Leeds Bridge commemorating him. He has a rather fine tombstone in Beckett Street Cemetery. But he founded the Band of Hope to bring children into the temperance fold. And this is a rather splendid photograph outside Sunbridge Road Mission in Bradford, which is still going. One of the few chapels which actually still prospering in Bradford. You can see there the slogan, "Drink and poverty go hand in hand," as the float is about to set off on its procession round what was a fairly poor neighbourhood in Edwardian Bradford. So the temperance movement was one reason why alcohol consumption declined. There are others which time prevents me from going into, that alcohol consumption declined towards the First World War and then spectacularly declined as a result of restrictions introduced in the First World War. The price of drink, especially spirits, quadrupled as a result of taxation. Spirits were diluted, and there were severe restrictions on when pubs could open. This is when the afternoon break came in. Prior to the First World War, pubs could open early in the morning, and they could stay open all day long till midnight and beyond. The First World War introduced the restrictions that some of us will remember, when you had to knock off between 3 o'clock and 5:30 before you could get back into the pub. As well as actually reduced consumption, there were shifts in consumption, very briefly, particularly middle-class consumption shifted towards whisky, with the development of blended whiskies, and therefore cheaper and more accessible whiskies. Gin rather moved into second place, and particularly gin began to be associated as a low-class drink. If you look at literary allusions, I'm a great fan of Dickens. Whenever gin features in Dickens novels, it's invariably in a negative light. The best known one is Mrs. Gamp, the nurse, who always has a smell of spirits floating around her. Although she says something like she could barely touch the stuff. And if you think of characters like the lady who runs the baby farm in Oliver Twist, she gives the infants Daffy's elixir, which was a cordial that had gin in it to keep children quiet, basically. And Mr. Bumble is fond of his gin, again another less than sympathetic character. And there are lots of references to gin. It only is mentioned positively when it's used in punch, gin punch. So Bob Cratchit makes a splendid gin punch for the family at the Cratchit Christmas, and Dickens apparently was enormously proud of his punch, his prowess in making a good punch. Next one, please. So by the time we get into the post First World War period, gin drinking, especially working class gin drinking, has declined markedly, certainly on its pre-war levels. What you did get in the interwar years is the so-called cocktail craze, a vogue for using gin in cocktails. These are all reproduced from a lovely little book by this chap called De Fleury, Drinks Ancient and Modern, which is actually a guide to cocktails. There are dozens, if not hundreds, of different cocktail recipes in this book. But the book also contains adverts for cocktail shakers, and as you can see here, the Mavis Portable Cocktail Bar. De Fleury had an interest in this company. It's not solely disinterested advertising. But a lot was made of this cocktail craze. Noel Coward has songs about gin drinking and so on. Quite how widespread was it is difficult to say. I rather take the view it's a bit like the swinging 60s. It may have been swinging in Carnaby Street, but it wasn't necessarily swinging in early 1960s Bradford. Growing up there, I can vouch for it. So it's something that's gone into the contemporary imagination, the cocktail craze. In other respects, gin continued that negative image. If you think in literary allusions, George Orwell in Burmese Days characterises booze, as he put it, as the cement of empire, and paints that picture of gin-sodden, whiskey-sodden colonials out there in Burma, passing their time drinking. And if you remember that the hero, if that's the right word, of the novel is brought down by women and gin, there's an epitaph on it. Similarly, he wrote in A Clergyman's Daughter, he presents the picture of the local gossip who's has a secret gin bottle. So you have this kind of old-fashioned image of gin-sodden colonials on the one hand, and kind of crabbed elderly ladies gossiping with their secret gin bottle on the other. And that really persists into the post-war period. Among young people, vodka overtook gin as a much more fashionable drink, and whiskey by then had established itself as the tipple of middle class men. Gin consumption declined, and it had this, on the one hand, old-fashioned, and on the other hand, low-class image. The next slide, please. A particular negative image is gin's association with bringing on a miscarriage. This was a property of juniper berries that was publicised, again from classical antiquity. And in the 20th century, there are several novels that portray this use of gin. It's something that became part of popular culture, if you like. This is perhaps the most famous one. It's from Silito's Saturday Night and Sunday Morning. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the novel, and perhaps even more so from the terrific film version of it, and especially the performances of these three. This is the scene where Arthur takes Brenda to see his Aunt Ada, splendidly played by the late great Hilda Baker, who was sometimes forgotten for these serious roles that she did, when they're discussing how best to end Brenda's pregnancy. and the recommendation is sit in a hot bath and drink a pint of gin. The novel quite graphically describes that. The film is rather more discreet. I think she says something like, it was so terrible I nearly died sitting in red hot water drinking her gin. In any case, it doesn't work, as is normally the case. Interestingly, the historian Hobsbawm, his woman who he was involved with also got pregnant, and they also tried this remedy, and Hobsbawm noted laconically that it didn't work then either. But it passed into popular culture, if you like, and was another negative attribute of gin. The next one, please. But in the later, towards the end of the 20th century and into our own century, gin had a kind of metamorphosis, if you like, as an upmarket designer product in what you can almost describe as a boom. Lots of reasons for this. Those of us who've got money are a lot more affluent. Those of us who like these things tend to like authentic designer, craft and so on. So these gins are sometimes called craft gins. It appeals to that aspect. Also, the legislation reduced the amount that you could legally distill. So small producers were then enabled to compete with the giants like Gordon's or, for example. So they grew up at a whole range of these smaller designer gin companies. There's a little book about Yorkshire gins, which I think there's something like 60 different gin enterprises in the county by 2000. This is one from Harrogate, Spirit of Harrogate. What they tended to do was tap into local history. So the Harrogate gin is called Slingsby. Slingsby was the guy who first popularised or discovered Harrogate's famous waters. Similarly, Whitby gin has a Dracula gin, again drawing on Whitby's most famous association. Next one, please. Further up from Harrogate, Nidderdale, there's a small distillery called Whitaker's. This is the still. Gives you some idea of smaller scale production. The couple who own this business were kind enough to show me around and spend an afternoon talking about gin. They first of all had a still from Kentucky. Kentucky, of course, noted for its illegal distilling of bourbon. And then this is the modern. It's 500 litres. It's still that size. And they produce Whitaker's gin. I think that's on the next slide, please, Margaret. Yeah, they produce this. The place where the distillery is called Harewell Farm. So the hare neatly conveys the place where it's distilled. And it's one of Thomas Bewick's beautiful illustrations. So as well as the local thing, you get the kind of historic, classic feel, if you like. And like lots of these gins, although they have juniper, they also included a range of other botanicals, and they always make a big thing of that. The Whitby gin, I think, incorporates seaweed. The other North Yorkshire ones incorporate stuff growing on the bog or among the heather. So, and as you can see there, true handcrafted Yorkshire gin. It's marketed in that kind of way. Next one, please. And since we're in York, there is, of course, York gin. This is outlaw gin. It's meant to recall to mind Guy Fawkes, Dick Turpin, and Mary Bateman, the poisoner. These are York's outlaws. The actual distillery went into administration, which is when I published the book, but apparently the company have now bought it back, so they're back to distilling. But they originally had two shops, one in the station and one which is still there in the centre of York. What was I just going to say then? But apparently it came out of administration fairly quickly, but it was unfortunate that I published the book while it was still in administration, just in case anybody points it out to me. But it partly reflected, and the people at Whittaker's conveyed that to me, that by the time I'm writing, which is the 2024, the bubble, if you like, was beginning to burst in the designer gin market, with the cost of living crisis, for example, and too much capacity, too many small designer gin companies, and this stuff is expensive. Compared to your 15 quid Gordons from Tesco, a bottle of craft designer gin can be £40 and upwards, and however nice it is, it's still a lot of money. So the people at Whittaker's were branching out as well into whiskies. However, these places are all still going, York Gin, Slingsby Gin, so there's clearly still a demand for it. Again, finally on the downside, and I'm nearly finished now, although it's not from a temperance point of view, equally criticism was voiced of making gin drinking attractive. It's what some academics have called the mummy drinking culture, making light of the fact that middle-aged women or young mothers and middle-aged women need wine and gin in order to cope with everyday life. There's a series of novels, and I forced myself to read one by a woman called Sims, called Why Mummy Drinks. If you know these, Why Mummy Drinks. Sadly, my local library has loads of them. As I pointed out to the librarian, the entire, excuse this moan for a minute, the entire North Yorkshire library system has fewer novels by Tolstoy, Dostoevsky and Turgenev than it has the novels of Nadine Dorris. Either says something for North Yorkshire or says something for the taste of those of us who live there. Be that as it may, this novel makes light of the fact that the central character needs gin to calm her nerves and can't apparently do anything without having a hefty glass of wine. And there has been a serious study of this mummy drinking culture and the fact that light is made. You can see if you go into shops selling greeting cards, that there are loads of them which make light of the fact that, you know, it's 11 o'clock, it must be time for the gin. This aspect of life. I think that the next book plays in. And there we are. If you forgive the plug, the book which I eventually did is this one, Gin in the English. It just came out last year. If you're really interested and you want to buy one, I negotiated a discount with them of 35% for the Harrogate Civic Society, but I'm happy to pass it on to you, which brings the price down to £26. This is Fiona Lang's book, Yorkshire's Gins, which is, I quite often see it in bookshops. And the modern classic study of the gin craze is by Jessica Warner, a Canadian academic who's written a lot about the history of gin.